Aubrey, do you often talk about your home?
No, never. Do you?
Yeah, actually I
You
do
do?
because I want to move. And one of my best friends is my
Mm.
neighbor. So like we're always talking about just
Mm,
where we live because we share the same building. But
gotcha.
guys, even if you don't really talk about your home all that often in real life, you have a 50% chance of being asked about your home on IELTS Speaking Part 1.
Yes, exactly. And you need a variety of vocabulary here, right? You need some idiomatic language, some informal vocab on task one. You've got to
Mhm.
be able to show some variety here. So when you are practicing talking about your home or you have to think about that. What vocabulary are you using?
I hear when I was an examiner, I heard a lot of this just the same answers just over and
Mm,
over again. I think some students try to memorize answers to common speaking questions. And there are books. I've seen books written with like full answers that students are memorizing. Um on Tuesday, guys, we talked about not memorizing task 2 essays, right? You also can't memorize speaking answers, guys, because it's obvious they're not yours. Okay. The examiner knows. I know if you're giving me a memorized answer. I've probably heard it before. It definitely sounds weird. And there isn't anything personal in it. Okay. So, guys, don't memorize speaking answers.
Yeah, instead you want to spend your time learning strategies, learning, what exactly is the scoring system looking for? You need to use linking phrases, right? You need to use interesting intonation. Your pronunciation matters. So that's where you should be spending your time, making sure that you are doing all of the things the examiner is listening for.
Exactly. So, we are going to give you 6 model answers today for speaking part 1 questions about home. These questions were reported as recently being on the exam. So, um, listen to our answers and I want you to try to take notes if possible, if you're not, driving or anything. Think about what vocabulary we use, how detailed and specific we get with our answers. Okay. All right. So I'm going to ask Aubrey 3 questions and then she's going to ask me 3 questions. Aubrey, are you ready?
I am ready. Let's do it.
All right. Do you live in a house or a flat?
I live in a house. It's a two-story dwelling. Unfortunately, there's a big drawback to the spaciousness of our home. I do love it, but the air conditioning bill is astronomical. Every time I get it, I'm like, why don't I live in a flat? We could all cram into a little two-bedroom flat. I wouldn't mind at all. I would trade that for the exorbitant fees coming from the electric company.
What is your favorite room in your home?
The kitchen is definitely my favorite room. We remodeled and it's very light and bright now. When we purchased the home, everything was dark brown. And now we've painted everything white and, it's very cheerful and sunny. And it definitely gets the most light of any room in the home. So I feel really good when I'm there. It gives me just that sunshine feeling to hang out there.
If you could improve one thing in your home, what would it be?
Hmm. I would lower the roof so that we don't have so much empty space that we're having to cool. I mentioned that the air conditioning is a problem. I would, as much as high ceilings are nice, they are just so wasteful as far when you live in Arizona. I live in the desert. It's 1,000 degrees and we can't afford to be cooling 4,000 square feet of empty hot air.
Thank you. Okay, guys, I want you to notice, I mean, those answers could only come from Aubrey in her home in Arizona, right? She's very specific about describing her real house, and very honest about the drawbacks of her home, right? I want to point out a couple great phrases that you guys can use when you're describing your houses on IELTS. Dwelling, great paraphrase for home, and that's great for task 2 as well. Um, to talk about how something's really expensive, air conditioning bills, electricity bills, mortgage, rent. There's a lot of things that can be described as expensive related to your home. So you could say the bill is astronomical. That's a great adjective. Or exorbitant. Both of those just mean crazy expensive. And Aubrey used both of those adjectives in her answers. And the last answer as well, I want to point out how Aubrey was careful to not repeat herself because as the examiner, I know that she already talked about the air conditioning and that's a bad thing, right? But I have to ask her the next question, even though she's already kind of answered it. Okay. So Aubrey did a great job of not repeating herself. She just said, as I mentioned, the air conditioning. And then she went on to add new details, new ideas to that answer. So that was a great job. Band 9.
Thank you. Yeah, this was interesting because words like astronomical and exorbitant, I'm like, I'm just using them, I'm throwing them out. I'm using astronomical to exaggerate. And you
Mm.
wouldn't normally think about that for part one if you're thinking, I need to use slang, I need to be very informal. But when you're showing a variety, sometimes these sort of more impressive formal words come up on part one as well. And you don't want to like stop yourself from using them and save them for part three. Just say what makes sense for the answer, right?
For sure. I mean, I use high level, quote unquote, academic vocabulary all the time because I love words, right?
Right.
You don't have to just only use high level vocab in part 3. That's a really good point.
All right, Jessica, are you ready for your questions?
I am.
Awesome. Okay. What do you like the most about your home?
Oh my gosh, I love so many things about my home. It's difficult. I'm gonna say the plants. I remember when my son was really little. He was around 5 years old, and he said that he wished he lived in a home with lots of plants. He wanted to see plants everywhere. And we'd recently moved. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is a great opportunity. And I started to get plants then. And that was, oh my gosh, what, like 7 years ago? And I have a lot of those plants I got 7 years ago. I still have them and they're huge. I absolutely love walking into my home and seeing just a wide variety of greenery in front of the window and in the kitchen and in the living room. And it just really makes the home feel so much more comfortable.
Can you describe the view from your windows?
Well, it's funny you should ask that because I just described all the plants in my home and I live in Portland, Oregon, and the view from my window also plants because Portland, Oregon is a green city. We have trees absolutely everywhere and I'm super lucky that my windows are not on the first floor. We're like a second, third floor dwelling. Um, and if you look out any window in our home, all you see are trees. And I'm so lucky because I can kind of forget that I live in a city, except for the noise sometimes. I could kind of pretend that I do just live in a forest in the middle of nowhere.
Do you plan to live there in the future?
Well, that is the big question. Up for debate, I could say, because I would absolutely love to move. But in today's economic climate, that is a tough thing to do. So, ideally, I'd like to actually move next year. But, fingers crossed, we'll see.
Oh, amazing. Okay, I'm excited to dive into some of this great vocab. Always, Jessica uses amazing intonation. So, if you find yourself slipping into a monotone for speaking answers, do some mimicking of these answers. Repeat back 10 seconds and make sure your tone varies as much as Jessica's. That is going to give you much higher pronunciation scores. And then vocab. First, you hear from us a lot to tell a story, and it's not just for task two to fill time. Part one questions as well. Jessica's first answer here, when she starts talking about plants and dives right into this story and says, I remember when my son, and tells a short story, and she's able to share so much detail. And I just want to point out, you're not limited with a question like this. What do you like the most about your home? It
Mm.
doesn't have to be, something actually about the house. I don't know, the doors, the carpet, whatever you
Right.
might feel like you're limited to talking about. It could be anything, the way
Yeah.
you've decorated it, the plants. You can be pretty flexible as long as you're answering the question, right?
Totally, totally. Yeah, I think a lot of students answer with like, I hear a lot of students answer and they just say, my bedroom. And I'm like, well, I mean, okay. But yeah, get a little creative with that one.
Yeah, exactly. And the more creative you are, the more you're going to have to say, the more
Mhm.
detail that's going to come up, right?
And the more
And
you'll
then,
stand out in front of the examiner, right? The examiner has heard
yes.
my bedroom 1,000 times. So if you talk about plants, the examiner's like, oh, hooray, I like this student.
Yes, right? Oh, something new, get them in a good mood for your school, exactly. And then I loved what you did. Well, 2 things. First of all, on the second question, you said, "It's funny you should ask," and we recently did an episode about this using funny, especially for filler phrases like this, so scroll
Mm,
up if you missed that one, to say something like this, to give yourself a little time, and it's always when something is like an interesting coincidence. So you'll say something like this, "It's funny you should ask," and then share why. Like, what is the coincidence that's
mhm.
bringing that up, right? So don't miss
Yeah.
that episode. And then lastly, on your last answer, I loved this phrase you said, that's up for debate, I could say. If there's an answer and you either don't know the answer, you haven't decided something, this is such a great native natural phrase to say, that's up for debate. And it's not literal, this is very idiomatic. No one's actually debating it. It just
No.
means I haven't decided yet. I don't know.
You could also say, TBD, to be
Yes.
determined. Don't just say the letters, like define what the acronym is. Say that
Mm.
whole thing. Well, honestly, that's TBD, to be determined.
Nice. Those are both so great. And this will happen. You're going to
Mhm,
be asked questions that you haven't decided yet about
for
something. You
sure.
don't know the answer yet. So be ready with this really high scoring vocabulary, these phrases that you can use for any answer when you don't really have a yes or a no.
Exactly. So, the takeaway, guys, is to be yourself, be specific in part one. Don't be afraid of using amazing, impressive words, just like we did, and get into your answers with your intonation, right? You want to, again, stand out with your ideas, stand out with your intonation and your vocabulary. We did an awesome episode recently, episode 1419. Hear Us Out for Band 9 Speaking, where you learn some amazing phrases like hear me out. So, definitely, guys, we're done with this episode today. So, scroll up and listen to 1419 if you missed that. And make sure to hit follow so you do not miss another episode.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. I'll see you next week.
Thanks, Aubrey. Bye.
Bye.